Before beginning, I'd like to make a brief announcement. After the lecture and the question and answer period, we're going to have coffee, punch, and a few refreshments, and all of you are invited to partake. By way of introduction, my name is Theodore Salutis. I happen to be a history professor here at UCLA. And on behalf of UCLA, the History Department, the Extension Division, I extend to you a very warm welcome. We are delighted that you have seen fit to honor us with your presence here this evening. As you probably know, UCLA has been sponsoring Negro History Week for many years, and we are again delighted that we have the opportunity to do so this year. Our speaker this evening is a professional historian, an author, and a man who's been very active in the civil rights movement. He is a graduate of Fisk University, University of Chicago, where he obtained his PhD with honors in 1939. He has taught in a number of institutions. Among other things, he formerly was curator of the Schomburg collection of Africana and Negroina in New York City. And currently, he is the official historian for King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He likewise is a director of a federal project to help improve teachers for inner-city schools, and a professor of social science at Coppin State College in Baltimore, Maryland. His writings include Crusade Without Violence, dealing primarily with Martin Luther King, and Worth Fighting For, which he co-authored with Agnes McCarthy. The subject of his lecture this evening is New Viewpoints for Negro History. Ladies and gentlemen, without taking any more of your time, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to present to you Professor L.D. Reddick of Coppin State College, Baltimore. Professor Reddick.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I've had a very pleasant time since I've been in your city. I understand this is rather cold weather for you. As indicated by Professor Salutis, I come from Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm not so sure that our television jingle gets this far out west, but there is a jingle that says, "Pleasant living on the banks of the Chesapeake." But within recent weeks, instead of being sun-kissed, the Chesapeake has been frozen, and snow has been piled so high that I think it would be better to say snow-kissed. And we're digging out of one of the worst blizzards we've had in some time. So as the plane neared L.A. today, and I saw the green hills, and as we got over the city, and I got a view of the ocean, I was indeed delighted that coming from the land of snow, I at least come to the land of sunshine. But they say things are always changing out here, and I think in 2 hours we had a little rain, and a little after that we had a little wind, and now we have, perhaps for you, cold weather. So I am getting a rather panoramic view of conditions of life, and I am enjoying it. I'd like to say further that my colleagues and friends of the university have been treating me royally. I'm sure that Professor Daniels has consumed almost his whole day in showing me about. He's escorted me over the campus, parts of the city, and I'm equally certain that Professor Salutis has spent considerable time of his in not only showing me about, but making contacts for me, because this is not my sole mission here. Part of my mission is to speak this evening, but tomorrow I am to make a one-day, one-man investigation of the so-called Watts riot. And, that's quite a thing. Chances are I'll go back and write a book that will not be at all circumscribed by the details. And Professor Salutis has spent considerable time in contacting his friends and other friends who will show me around tomorrow. Perhaps I should also say that a word of compliment should be paid the university for this meeting. It's always encouraging to see the town and the gown somewhat together, and I add my 2 cents worth by saying that it is good that the university should be interested in the community, and I hope too that this interest is reflected in the completely open-door policy for all students, in the curriculum where the courses of study reflect this wide interest, and also in the employment policy of the university where the faculty is cosmopolitan in terms of appearances as well as in terms of scholarship. I think, too, that perhaps the university should feel a certain responsibility concerning Watts, or the community as a whole. And in turn, Watts has a responsibility for the university. Now, the real test of the cooperation of town and gown is to be found in an imaginary situation. Suppose the cultural barbarians were invading the city and word spread around that they were going to attack the university. Would the people of the town, including Watts, feel that they should line up, should man the barricades, should defend the university? Because it was their university that had shown interest in them, had identified with them, and they with it. But if you feel that the people would not be aroused and interested to come to the defense of the university, then perhaps a little more work needs to be done in terms of getting the town and gown together. Perhaps after this little sermon I should move a little closer to the subject of the evening. And maybe before I do that, if you'll permit another digression, I might comment upon the splendid meal that was supplied to me a little earlier. I think I overdid it a little, maybe I ate too much, and so I am a little drowsy, and you may see here something that you don't see so often. Frequently we see the audience going to sleep on the speaker, but you may see the speaker go to sleep on the audience. At least I hope that I will keep awake and not resemble that member of the British Parliament who dreamed that he was making a speech there and woke up to find that it was true. Yes. Well, I finally got a laugh, Professor Salutis, and so now move to my subject. I believe that our subject is history tonight, and I wish to say what you already know, that all history is a myth, really a social myth. No history can be completely true And therefore we have versions of history. I think it was Carl Becker who said that every man must be his own historian. Maybe this is taking it a little too far. But at least each group, every group, must have its history, must have its historians. For one of the prime uses of history is to give identity, establish and maintain identity, a certain sense of continuity, a certain sense of man overwhelmed by circumstance, or man triumphing over circumstance. And so, in a way, it is not essential that history should be true if history serves these purposes. Accordingly, we have world history, national history, regional history, history of all sorts of groups. And there is a certain arrogance about established history as it looks at new history. When the American nation was developing and when its early historians began to write, the Europeans looked down upon what was called American history. As you probably know, there was no such thing in the British textbooks about the American Revolution. It was the colonial rebellion. And it was not until the First World War that the universities in Europe began to offer courses in American history. And these were not greatly expanded until the Second World War. That is, our nation had to become a world power before its history was generally accepted by the established history of Europe. And in like manner, the first group of historians in this country seem to have come largely from New England. And so they wrote the history of the United States from that point of view. I'm told that one of the historians at Harvard, even in the 20th century, referred to that part of the country beyond the Alleghenies as Trans-Allegheny. His conception was that maybe the important part of the country was over on the eastern Atlantic coast, and then after that it was Trans-Allegheny. That should be appended somehow. And until Frederick Jackson Turner came along, the West was not generally respected in the councils of the historians of New England. And the same story was quite similar for the South. Then we have had histories, and do have histories, of immigrant groups. Almost all of the groups, especially from Europe, that have come have had historical societies and have turned out histories. So we've had the Irish American Historical Association and similar groups for the Poles and the Italians and so on and so forth. And since I've been in your city, I've discovered that we now have a very good history of the Greeks in America. And this is adding to the story quite a bit. Well, now, as national history grows, it has a tendency to absorb these smaller group histories. Many of the locals of the Irish American Historical Society no longer meet. The link with the old country is not considered very necessary. The young people do not think so much in terms of the old country. And so the national history tends to absorb the local and the ethnic histories of these groups. But when you come to Negro history, the story is somewhat different, in part because the Negro people are not losing their identity as quickly as some of the immigrant groups have. And the other part of it is that perhaps today some of the Negro people are not interested in losing this identity. Around New York City, for example, especially in connection with the intellectual and entertainment industry and life, you find quite a few of the young Negro girls who no longer try to oil or press their hair, but they wear it in the natural or the African style. And I attended a writers' conference there not so long ago, and one of the speakers along this line of negritude said that formerly Negroes used to go around asking, "Who am I?" But they don't ask that now. They say, looking their fellow white Americans in the eye, the question is no longer, "Who am I?" but "Who the hell are you?" So that shows something of a change point of view. So Negro history, therefore, may not be absorbed, may not disappear as quickly as has the histories of these immigrant groups. But there's another reason for the persistence, shall we say, the necessity of Negro history. And that is your national standard histories do not reflect an image of the Negro people that is acceptable to them. The average textbook of American history gives a view of the Negro in American history that resembles the stereotype of the Negro. The savage African, the happy, docile, contented slave, the, shall we say, disruptive, corrupt, new citizen during the Reconstruction period. And after that, the Negro is treated principally as a problem, or as a failure, or as a man who somehow didn't quite make it. This is completely unacceptable to the Negro people. And this is another reason for the persistence of Negro history. It may surprise you, but I submit it to you for your consideration, that the version of history that is presented by the Muslims, the nation of Islam, or as they're sometimes called, black Muslims, is a more acceptable version or image of the Negro people than that found in your standard American textbook. Perhaps you've heard the song which tells this story from the Muslim point of view. It's recorded as very moving music. It's entitled, "The White Man's Heaven is the Black Man's Hell." Now this is a version of history. It tells the story of the expansion of the European, of how he went to Africa and Asia and ravished those continents and exploited those people, of how he came to the New World and drove the Indian back, took the land away from him, and finally cooped him up in the reservation. of how he brought over the African slave and made him work in the field. So you do have a version which explains in terms of history the position of the Negro people today. They are, in this version, identified as the chosen people who have been exploited and mistreated. Their opponents and exploiters are identified as devils. See, we've long had the devil theory of history, but this is the white devil theory of history. And it ends up on a note of triumph, that despite all these difficulties, despite all these devils, that the people will finally rise in the end and will prevail. Now, this version of history is more acceptable to the Negro people, is more useful, is more inspiring to Negro children than is the picture that they would get from reading the standard textbook. Of course it has inaccuracies. Of course it has distortions. Of course it has racism. But this is also true of your standard American histories. I think I mentioned to one of our friends and fellow historians today that in a standard textbook written by Harvard professor Samuel Morrison and Columbia University professor, he was then, commenter, the word Sambo is used not in quotes, not in a quoted passage, but in the text in describing the Negro. So you have that. And you have throughout many of these books the Negro as a non-hero and often as a villain, especially when it comes to the Reconstruction period. So I say that in terms of the usefulness of history as a social myth, that the Muslim version is more acceptable than the standard textbook version. I'm prepared to argue this out with you. Now, since Negro history, therefore, is necessary, it is well that it should be, from the professional point of view, good history. But a funny thing has happened on the way to making Negro history better history. Some of us have discovered that not only is it good for the Negro people, not only is it good in general, but it may be that in order to understand America, we must study and develop Negro history. Let me submit 2 or 3 examples of this. I will debate with you this thesis, that if not a single Negro, not a single African had set foot on the American continent, that what we call American civilization would in part be African culture. Let me back up and say that again. If there were no Negroes in America, if no Africans had ever come here or had been brought here, I say what we have today, or what we would have today, would reflect in part African culture. I would put it this way. If there had been no Ethiopia or Egypt or Meroe or Ghana or Songhai or Zimbabwe or Timbuktu, it would have been necessary to invent them for the purposes of Negro history. But it is a matter of record that there were these ancient and medieval kingdoms and cultures in Africa. But to go back to ancient Africa, if Ethiopia taught something to Egypt, and Egypt taught something to Greece, and Greece taught something to Rome, and Rome taught something to Western Europe, and Western Europe taught something to America, in this indirect roundabout way, as culture moves, we do have something of Africa in American culture today. So if no Africans had come across the Atlantic, what we would call American civilization would reflect, maybe remotely, maybe it would be difficult to distinguish the discrete symbols of it, but it would be here. And I suggest that if we'd get an energetic candidate for the PhD to working on that hypothesis, that he might turn up some very interesting materials. More easily, I think we could submit the thesis that the New World could not have been developed as quickly or as effectively as it was without Africa. As you know from your American history, when Europe discovered, shall we say, the existence of the New World, there was the great rush to try to develop it. And labor was a great need. And with all the efforts to persuade men to come over, the land grants and all that, with all of the kidnapping that took place in the streets of London, with all of the convicts who were sent over, the labor question was not answered. And the labor question was not answered until Africans were enslaved and imported. So it is possible to say in part that the Africans, or the Negro, shall we say, helped build the New World. 1/20 of the population of what became the United States was of African descent in the colonial period. But there's more to the story than that. How did it happen that the Western world was able to acquire the capital for the development of the industrial society that we know? Part of it came, you recall, from the invention of the joint stock company, whereby you would gather up the savings of many and put them together. Part came from looting the Indians of Mexico and Peru. And of course, the pirates and buccaneers fell upon these Spanish ships going back. So that was a great source. And a third great source of capital accumulation was from the profits of the slave trade. And such towns as Bristol and Liverpool were built upon the profits from that trade. So if you look from the economic point of view at the development of the New World, not only do you put down the labor, but you also should put down the capital accumulation, which in part contributed to the development of the modern world as we know it. Now, I have not seen a single standard American history textbook that makes this clear, and not a single one that makes it clear that in supplying the labor, the involuntary labor, for the development of the New World, and one source of capital, that Europe wrecked Africa. African societies were wrecked. Consider what would happen if half the population of your city should be taken away, if most of the young men should be taken away, and if with nuclear weapons some foreign power would say that unless you raided the surrounding territory and supplied this foreign power with so many men each month, that more of your young men would be taken away. The analogy is that with gunpowder coming in the hands of the Europeans, this was the kind of imposition that was made on the west coast of Africa. Whole areas were depopulated. Wars between kingdoms were stimulated. And though Africa was behind Europe already in terms of the scientific revolution, it was thrown way back. But there is not a single American history textbook that I've ever seen that makes clear that the supplying of slave labor to the New World wrecked Africa, wrecked the societies that were there. And so on. We could go on with the story. We could follow it through till the Cotton Kingdom came, and we all know that the Cotton Kingdom was erected on the backs of the black slaves. So it is not possible to understand the development of the New World and the establishing of the economy, the basic economy out of which you've had this superstructure come, without consideration of what in a broad sense you might call Negro history. Let me submit one more theme, please. That is the fight for freedom. This is a great theme in American history, the fight for freedom. The old history books used to tell the story of how the disgruntled English-American colonists rose up as one man and threw the British into the Atlantic Ocean. Well, we know much better than that today. We know that without aid from the French, we would not have accomplished it. We know, too, that at least a third of the colonials were somewhat indifferent to the war, or couldn't be depended upon, that another third opposed it, preferred to remain with the mother country, and that only 1/3 of the emerging American people consistently and enthusiastically supported the American Revolution, and that this third included your Negroes, your poor whites, your backcountry people. So the case could be made that the Negro people helped establish the American Republic. We take a later period, the Civil War period. Most books give the impression that it was a fight between abolitionists in the North, maybe industrialists in the North, Southern plantation owners, and that your slaves somewhat stood aside and freedom was granted to them on a silver platter. Perhaps I could put in a little commercial at this point. Mrs. McCarthy and I wrote a little book called Worth Fighting For, which is essentially the story of the active participation of the Negro people in the Civil War. And it is amazing what kind of response, how many letters, so many people, educated people, college and university people, who find that this is a new and strange story. Lincoln said that without the help of the Negro people, the North would not have won the war. I would say may not have won the war. But Lincoln said would not have won the war. He said if you take the 200 soldiers, black soldiers who are fighting on the Union side, take them away from the Union, put them in the army or the fields of the Confederacy, the war would have gone the other way. Then, almost nobody seems to know this, many of the historians don't seem to know this, that in the last dark days of the Confederacy, when it seemed as though the lost cause was indeed lost, that General Robert E. Lee wrote to the presidency of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, asking for Negro troops. And Jefferson Davis asked the Confederate Congress for Negro troops, and the Confederate Congress voted to raise Negro troops to fight for the Confederacy. So here you have a strange paradox of a government established, as its vice president, Alexander Stevens says, upon the foundation of the superiority of one race over the other, calling upon the inferior race to save it in its hour of need. It was too late. These troops were not raised. But the big point is, it seems to me, from the standpoint of understanding human behavior, is that Robert E. Lee asked for these troops, wanted them. Jefferson Davis asked for these troops, wanted them, and that the Confederate Congress voted to give these troops. Then, finally, when we come to the Reconstruction period, this is perhaps the most misinterpreted period, the most unacceptable picture that the standard textbook gives. And I do not wish to submit it now as an acceptable picture to the Negro people alone, but I'd like to submit it as a chapter in the evolution of political democracy in America. It seems to me that one of the great strides forward toward political democracy in America came about the time that Andrew Jackson was president. About this time, most of the states, especially those that were trans-Allegheny, gave universal white manhood suffrage. That is, if you were a white man, most of the extra qualifications, such as property and all that, were eliminated. And this was a great stride toward political democracy in this country. The second great step came, I believe, during the Reconstruction period, where the Negro, for the first time, was granted the right to vote. That is, Negro males. You know, the 14th and 15th Amendments. And the third great stride came when the 19th Amendment became a part of the Constitution, and women, for the first time, got the right, federally, to vote. So it seems to me that if one would want to understand the growth and development of political democracy in this country, it would surely have to include what happened about the time of Andrew Jackson, what happened in the Reconstruction period, and what happened at the time of Woodrow Wilson and the 19th Amendment, and so on. You know better than I what the civil rights movement has done to the whole commitment for democracy and the agitation for equality in this country. Perhaps I've said enough, at least to stimulate a few questions, and I close with this proposition. Negro history is needed in order to give the Negro people an acceptable self-image. It is needed in order to give their fellow Americans a worthy image. And it is needed if we would understand America with any depth in terms of how she has become what she is, and in terms of the possibility of this becoming really a democratic, equalitarian, happy brotherhood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reddick. I'm sure that there are a series of questions to be raised from the floor. Professor Reddick has indicated that he will be most happy to answer your questions. I think we can take approximately half an hour or so to continue in this fashion. Yes? Direct your question to Professor Reddick, yes.
Can you hear him in the back? Would you stand, please, if you don't mind, so they can hear you?
Other nationality groups were losing their identity, and
Well, I quite agree with you, and I think in the first part of your comment, you were using identity in a slightly different way. I mean, identity as a sort of separate group. I know in some places where once you had strong Irish-American historical societies, only the older people come now, and the younger people who don't think of themselves as being Irish, but think of themselves as being more American, and they see in some books accounts of the Irish, so they don't quite have that same feeling. I know around Baltimore, the Polish people have difficulty in celebrating the days of the Polish heroes, and I know on St. Patrick's Day in Baltimore, you have more non-Irish participating in the parade than Irish, which of course is very good. Yes, but I quite agree with what you say. Yes.
Any other questions?
Did you have a question, sir? Yes.
I just wanted to comment when you said again, perhaps the Negro will find his identity in, well, how do you say, discovering Negro history. And I wondered, when you were first talking, you mentioned about how Europeans went into Asia and went into Africa and swept those continents, brought these people to this country. When you talk about the Negro looking for identity, I wonder if you conceive of the American Negro as a being in a sort of state of shock. If Negro history actually could be found in those ships coming over here, in that frightened, angry man in the hole who has seen no light, in that man laboring in the field, in that man now that you see marked. I wonder if this is the history, the true history you're looking for, or are you going to go back to Timbuktu? Is it really necessary to go back to Africa to search up the relic? Can the history, can that identity be in throwing the shock of the trip over?
Getting rid of the shock, is that right? Yes. Well, I put it to you this way. Most Americans of European ancestry hark back to the old country. I think I read when I was in elementary school a book called American Beginnings in Europe. They go back. But I didn't have a book, American Beginnings in Africa. There should be another book that way. You see, if 4/5 of the people who settled the colonial territory, the 13 colonies that became the 13 states, if 4/5 of them came from Europe, you should have a book 1/5 the size of the big book on the Americans who came from Africa. Equal time, proportional time. You should have something of that sort. And psychologically, I think it does help for one to be able to say, not only am I a man, but my father before me and my grandfather before me. And you see, you go back a few generations and you cross the ocean and you go back to Europe and you go back to Africa. That is just one more reason. Then another use of history is to explain how it happened that we got into this ditch. Now, your standard American history, by implication, explains it in terms of the lack of fighting spirit. Some books put it this way. The American Indian could not be enslaved. He had a strong, independent feeling. He could not be a slave. But the African could be enslaved. See, it puts it upon the weakness of will, of personality. Whereas, of course, it wasn't that at all. The Europeans came down with gunpowder. So if a man knows that his grandfather was enslaved because another man had a superior weapon of war, that means one thing to him. But if he takes the story that the textbook gives him, that his grandfather was a savage and that he liked being a slave, he was happy, he would sing songs and strum the banjo, it means quite a different thing, you see. And part of what we call Negro history is not only to straighten out that African part, but to straighten out the interpretations, because it's quite possible, with all the intelligent people here, two gunmen could come in the door and back us all up against the wall. See, we have intelligence and courage and all that, but they would have superior weapons of war. We have accounts of some of the early contacts of the West Africans with Europeans who came down with guns. And in one scene, which I remember quite well from reading, the African warriors lined up on a hill with their spears and shields, and they were going to make a great defense. But the Europeans stayed down the valley and shot them down at a distance and threw them in confusion. Well, that was quite a disaster. But you remember in June 1940, when the German panzer divisions broke through the French lines, the French army was supposed to be the greatest army in Europe. But when those dive bombers and panzer divisions, the tanks, came through, they surrounded over 1 million men and knocked France out just like that. It wasn't that the French were not as courageous as the Germans, but it was a question of superior weapons of war. Well, that makes sense to people, and that doesn't make a Negro child feel that his ancestors were less courageous than others. It explains things in terms of what we know. Maybe I didn't mean to answer that way. Yes, please. Yes. Well, I'm not an authority on the Muslims, but I will say that if you take a cold, objective look at the Muslims' version of history and what we might call white history, not because of the color of the skins of a lot of people who write it, but that the European and the European in America is the center of the hero of the story, that these are very similar. Now, one version may be supported with a little bit of scholarship, might be a little more subtle, you might have more footnotes and all that. But in terms of supplying a partial picture in order to suit certain psychological needs, you have something of that. You take the story, for example, of our expansion into the West with, the pioneer going out, and with his schooner. You've seen it 1,000 times in the movie. And those mean old Indians looking down upon them, and they start coming down, and the schooner trio will get together, and the Indians will attack, and they will shoot them down. And finally, right and justice is therefore triumphant. Whereas more realistic historians would point out how the European American pioneers began to kill off the buffalo, and the Indian saw that his whole life was being wiped out, the very source. He lived on the buffalo. His meat, his hide, everything. And when they were coming out that way, he had to take a stand. Well, that is something in terms of the version. In terms of the Muslims, if you don't mind, I'd like to refer you to a couple of books that I think explain them pretty well. One is James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. The Fire Next Time, or Next Time the Fire. Baldwin is not a Muslim himself, but he did visit the head of the movement and gives a sympathetic, though critical, appraisal of him. And then, of course, the Muslim leader has put out his own book called Message for the Black Man, which you might want to read, as coming from the head of the movement, no matter, what our own ideas might be about that. Eric Lincoln has the book, The Black Muslims in America, and one of the African scholars, S.E.N. Oden, has written a book called Black Nationalism that is exceedingly interesting in that you have an African scholar looking at the whole question from a rather broad perspective. Well, I don't quite agree with them personally. I'm a little closer to Martin Luther King than I am to them. But I equate them in terms of their emphasis in history and maybe distortions of history with some of the professors of history at some of our great universities. Yeah, yes, sir. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, I say to you, as I said to some of my students sometime, you'll forgive me for taking the professorial road, you have made so many comments that I'll almost have to do another lecture to take up most of your points. I would agree with your first general statement with the exception of the onlys. I think you threw in only once or twice. I would not say that history is only a social myth and that we need go no further than that. But I think it is necessary for us to realize that all history is limited, that there is no history that is absolutely true. Charles Beard, you recall, used to say, history as actuality is one thing. That's the ideal. But history as written can only approach that ideal. So I think in order to get a clear view of the function of history, we must realize that all history has its limitations. But we don't stop there. We try to make it as accurate as possible. I think, somewhat facetiously, that if I were a Muslim, I would try to get a good PhD who knew documentation very well and could take their story and straighten it out a little more. I think it would be a better myth, a more convincing myth, if some of the distortions and inaccuracies were taken out. But personally, I believe in the ideal of a conception of actuality as it occurred, and that it is the job of the professional historian to try to approach that. While I'm at it, I might put in one of my points about the training of historians. I believe before we should let our new PhDs loose, in terms of research, we should give them an experience of working in a culture or a subculture different from their own. It's very difficult to write outside of your experience. And these invisible biases, these implicit biases, are usually there. So it would be a good thing, if after a man has passed his orals and submitted his dissertation, we'd get him fellowship, let him go abroad. Let him go to Hawaii or Brazil or somewhere else. Let him stay there a year, you see. When he'd come back, he'd be a much more objective historian. Yes, sir. I think that Stamp and Franklin have made great improvements. Now, one of the difficulty is the historian is usually enslaved to his documents. And many of the documents don't exist. For example, we have the records of the plantation owner, but we don't have records from the slave cabins. So even if you use the documents as carefully as possible, you would have incomplete documentation. But it is part of the job of the historian to realize that. Once there was a federal project to collect the testimony of ex-slaves. This, of course, had all sorts of weaknesses. It was remembering something years later. But it did help, and it was an effort to fill a gap. But I think Franklin and Stamp have done a great deal, but I don't think, generally speaking, historians are willing to admit that in certain areas we simply don't have the evidence. That would be my comment there. Yes, the young lady here, then you next, please. Yes. Yes. Yes, did you hear that comment that the civil rights movement, would the civil rights movement be helped, spurred along if maybe the civil writers knew a little more about history? Is that the implication? I think so. I made a little talk once to a convention of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as you know, which is Dr. King's organization. And many of the civil rights enthusiasts were a little surprised to know that the movement for civil rights didn't begin with the Montgomery bus boycott. I quoted some of the statements made by people in the colonial period, in the middle period, and in the Civil War period, and afterwards, without putting any dates on them. And they were sure that some of their colleagues had made those statements. But those statements were made decades and sometimes 100 years before. I think it would help a great deal if, between demonstrations, some of the civil rights people had time to read a little history. Yes. You have a question, please. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. how can we stop it? Well, I had a chance to meet Margaret Mitchell once, you know, the author of Gone with the Wind, and she told me that she was 10 years old. So she had heard about the Civil War since she was born, but she was 10 years old before she realized that the South lost the Civil War. That all the versions she had been hearing were of how the Southerners chased the Northerners and how they won here and how they won there and all that. And she was 10 years old before she realized that. And historians don't like to admit it, but the history books are not the only source of history. Gone with the Wind did more to shape historical attitudes than any history book I can think of. People read the story, they read the novel, millions of copies sold. They made the movie, you remember Vivian Leigh and Clark Gable, and all those people, you know. And so there is an image, there is a belief. And when you see a man come on your television screen, as one came on from Alabama the other day, when they were voting to change the symbol, you know, they used to have the little rooster there saying white supremacy. That was the Democratic symbol in Alabama. Well, they voted to change that. So he said very seriously and indignantly, he said, I was ashamed of those white Southern women who voted for that. He sincerely felt that something had gone wrong. So by reading Gone with the Wind, so read The Rose, maybe the old Ulsters, Birth of the Nation and all that, it sort of soaks in, and you have a vision of life and a vision of history. In fairness, we should say that this, in a way, is human and is natural. We all try to rationalize what we do. We all try to hide what we do that we believe is wrong. See? But I think there is hope for us all, and maybe in exchanges like this, we try to do better. Yes, sir. Gentleman way back there. Yes.
You're speaking of the people that are leaders, those people that are actually on the front of battles, like the older people who are actually out there struggling and being beaten and shot at and thrown in jail or what?
I'm speaking of all of them. I'm speaking of Martin Luther King and Roy Wilkins, and Jim Farmer sort of passed on a little, and James Foreman, and I'm also speaking of the rank and file. And maybe it would help a little if you're marching out on the line and you figured that maybe your father was a prince, professor at the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, you know. That gives you maybe a little strength, you know, to be brutalized a little. Yeah. Yeah. Well, to be serious about it, I wasn't so serious then. If the people who participate in the civil rights movement have a sense of history and not merely a sense of immediacy, this gives them a double strength to endure it. Just as the Greeks, when they would think of maybe the Peloponnesian War, or the war against the Persians, you know, and what is it, Thermopylae? Yes, all of that. And what was it, Rome for the Horatio at the bridge, even though that may be a legend and all that. That gives you a certain psychological strength that you come from a tradition of courage and valor, and you can endure a little more, I believe. Yes. Yes, all right. Well, it helps me. Now, it may be that you realize how right you are today and how wrong the people are against you, and that is enough for you. But with me, if I also knew that when something similar or worse came to my grandfather, and he stood up against the overseer, or he threw him down as Frederick Douglass did, or if he joined the Union forces if he helped Sherman march through Georgia. That gives me a little added strength, to take it a little further. All right. It's all right. Yeah. Yeah. All right, let me stop you. Now that's where you made your mistake in your argument. See, you had me until you made that point. But I have been in. Then you'll let me finish? Yes, go right on. You finish. Yes. Yeah. 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 Well, I'll agree to that, but let me finish my point now. I was in Mississippi talking to some people who were fighting to get the right to vote. This was outside of Jackson, Mississippi. And I said to them this: don't be discouraged. At one time, Mississippi had Negro senators in the U.S. Congress, in the U.S. Senate. They said they did, and I told them the story of Senator Revels and Senator Bruce, and I think that electrified that meeting. So I would say that some people in Mississippi seem to get a little added strength from knowing that once the Negroes of Mississippi had 2 senators in the United States Senate. You're from Mississippi too. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, I'll see you after the meeting here. All right, sir. Yes. 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 That is, you disagree that the North won the Civil War? Yeah. Well, I know what you mean in terms of maybe an idea and all that, but from the military point of view, wouldn't you say the North won the Civil War? Yes. Yeah. Yes. 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 That's true. Oh. Well, why was it that the tribes on the coast began to go to the interior and capture other tribes and bring them to the coast? Yes, for money, and money coupled with force. You see, had there not been the Atlantic slave trade, there would have been no market for these. Yes. Yes, sir. Maybe this gentleman will raise the last question. Yeah. Yes, sir. Can you hear him a little louder, please? Yeah. You mean now? Yeah. Yeah. I think the question is to the effect that though for a considerable period it appeared that the Negro was relatively quiet, then all at once he broke out in all these demonstrations. Is that the idea? Yes. 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 I'm not so sure that I get your question completely, but let me make 2 or 3 comments that I hope will be relevant. In the first place, during the slavery period, you had a great many slaves running away, the Underground Railroad. Then you did have slave revolts and attempts, which would show that even during the slavery period, they weren't contented. Now, I want to bring it up. Yes, yeah. Yeah, I wanted to bring it up to that. I think certain general forces of development in the world and in the country had a great deal to do with it. To be specific, I think, for example, your Supreme Court decision of 1954 took away the sanction that had been placed upon segregation by the old Supreme Court, which in Plessy versus Ferguson had declared that as long as you give equal accommodations, it's all right to separate them. You didn't have the equality, but you did have the separation. I think that helped a great deal. I think, too, that in your Montgomery bus boycott, when Negroes themselves moved as a group and with instruments that they could use in the South, where your force of the opposition was quite strong. And the success of this boycott, I think, had a great deal to do with it. Then you had a new group on February the 1st, 1960, entering the fray. Your educated college young people. That is, you remember at Greensboro, and the first sit-in occurred there. I think, too, that television, by getting the story around, by having everybody see it, having other groups see it, I think spread it very fast, too. So I would think that certain of the general forces helped greatly. Yes. Yes. Well, I see your point. Well, I think, Professor Salutis, I have used up all of my time, a little more, and I'd like to thank this audience. I really enjoyed it, and although I wasn't absolutely serious in everything I said, I really liked the intellectual exchange. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that Professor Reddick has thrown out some very stimulating thoughts, and I know that we are all indebted to him for taking time out to speak to us tonight. And I feel that some of you would like to have the opportunity to carry this on a bit further when we adjourn. Let me remind you that a few refreshments are available out in the hall. We invite all of you to partake of them. And again, Professor Reddick, thank you very much for making this a very stimulating